more about your journey that led you to the Division of Juvenile Justice, or CYA?
Yeah, so as a young man, especially as I was leaving my high school years and considering going into higher education, really felt a calling to become a pastor, but at that early stage of discernment, thought that that only meant going into a local church or a local parish. However, in my early 20s, in the year 2000, I received a phone call from the Protestant chaplain at the Preston Youth Correctional Facility, and he was a friend of my father's, and he asked if I would be willing to come in and assist him in putting together a seasonal choir for the Christmas program that Preston did each year for all of their volunteers. And without any hesitation, I immediately said no. I had no desire to go into a prison, to go into a correctional setting. That was not where I felt I was being called. And he graciously said okay and hung up. The following week, he called me back and attempted to convince me again of why this might be a good idea. And again, just assured him that thank you, but no thank you. A few weeks later, my dad called me and said, hey, this gentleman has reached out to me and asked why you're not wanting to do this. So I had a long conversation with my dad, and who just encouraged me, hey, this doesn't mean that you're choosing a career, but just be available and be of service in that capacity. And so, kind of a bit begrudgingly, I accepted his invitation, went in that first Sunday, saw the chapel full of young men. And I remember too that as I was looking out over the chapel from the back, seeing heads, everybody wearing the same uniform, and watching with almost shock just how quiet and reverent they were in that beautiful chapel at Preston, listening to this chaplain preach. What an opportunity, where these youth were going to come from all over the state of California. And while they might be incarcerated for various different reasons, within that incarcerated setting, there was an opportunity for them to experience grace and forgiveness. And that really got me. And I walked away that morning thinking, how do I get more involved with this? Walk through that 6-week period of helping to produce a choir, got to know some of the guys, they got to know me. And at the conclusion of that event, went and sat down, had a conversation with the chaplain and asked if I could become a volunteer. And it was through that next year of just going in as a volunteer that more and more affirmation of this might be where you need to be, that I realized that indeed I was being called to be a pastor. However, my congregation just might look a little bit different than the average pastor in the community. And so I began to pursue a seminary education, completed that, and then was ordained as a minister. All of that taking place while I was at Preston. And the CYA, which transitioned to the DJJ during my internship, really was probably the best classroom I could have ever had in my development in pastoral ministry. Because every Sunday and then throughout the week while I was interacting with the youth, the challenge would always be posed to me. How do you take great big spiritual, theological truths and break them down to explain them to youth that may have never experienced this or been exposed to this before? And I remember even in my studies, in my mind's eye, there would be a row of youth that I might have a relationship with, from Manzanita or Buckeye or Evergreen or Juniper or Sequoia, or even the locked up unit in Preston, which was Tamarack. Conversations that I had with these youth. And as I would sit down in my studies, they would be there in my mind's eye looking at me, almost daring me, how are you going to break this down so that we can understand this? And it was a joy to go in each week and wrestle with them, with these big concepts, and to see from time to time the light go off and some of them make a connection to that truth, and then to watch a change begin to take place in our context of spiritual change from the heart, from the inside, which then began to demonstrate itself outward.
This change, when we talk about community restoration and forgiveness, how does chaplaincy and ministry fit with this notion that there needs to be sort of a community restoration that takes place?
That's a great question, and I think for us that have worked in the CYA and in the DJJ, in the religious programs and in the chapel settings, a big part of our message is that of reconciliation, of wanting restoration to take place, but a lot of that happens, spiritually speaking, through a reconciling that takes place as well. First of all, the youth coming to a place where they feel that they have found reconciliation with God, as perhaps they never knew of Him or had run away or rebelled against how they might have been raised or whatever, but to find a peace and a reconciliation with God, which then could translate into a reconciliation with maybe those that they had offended in their commitment offense, or even as we work through local issues in the institution of gangs and racial issues and such, to really labor at that message of reconciliation, because without reconciliation, restoration just becomes a chess game. But if it takes place first in the heart, then there can be a genuine restoration that can occur. So I think the chapel programs and the religious service department of CYA DJJ really came right alongside that whole process of attempting to restore youth to the community and to prepare the community for receiving the youth through that process of reconciling and reconciliation.
During your time here, you saw the Farrell lawsuit and the changes that took place during that. How did that affect the way you did your job and the way you perceived operations occurring throughout the organization?
I think one of the biggest changes that occurred as a result of the Farrell lawsuit, which the religious services was a big part of, before Farrell, INC branch policy had, I believe, about a 4-page statement about how religious services would be facilitated within an institution. After Farrell, we jumped to a 26-page religious policy. And then after a couple adjustments, we moved to a 28-page. So a lot more information was laid out and spelled out. Primarily, the biggest change that occurred was documentation. Just really making sure that we had appropriate documentation of youth that, first of all, were requesting and wanting to be involved in religious services, creating a whole sign-up process where the living unit staff and the youth worked together to ensure that their names were on a list so that they could actually attend when services were called. And then once a youth's attendance took place, then there was a lot of documentation through the chaplain's office of youth for reasons that they may not have attended. If it was just they didn't want to, a refusal, or if they were for some reason unable to due to a restriction or a health reason or whatever. And if that was the case, then there was a guarantee that somehow, some way, within 7 days, there would be a religious service provided to them if they could not attend the actual group setting. So there was much more awareness of documentation, of guaranteeing actual weekly contact between the religious service staff, the chaplains, and the youth population. That really was part of the biggest change that we saw. There are so many stories. I honestly don't even know where to begin, because as soon as you asked that question, there was a flood of faces that came into my mind. I mean, over the years, I've forgotten a lot of names, but faces have always stayed with me, and I have these faces of different youth that I definitely remember, going all the way back to when I first began as just a young a young seminarian. There was one young man, he and I both started at Preston at the same time. I came in as an intern and he came in as a new commitment. And he was in there for a very, very serious offense. And he one day came up to chapel as another youth invited him to come. You could very quickly observe that he was kind of dealing with depression, a lack of self-confidence, and I made a point to reach out to him and to introduce myself and to ask if there might be a way that we could start to have conversation. He was a bit hesitant at first, but continued to come to chapel. But then over time, he would ask staff to call that he could come up to the chapel and meet with the chaplain or with the intern at that time. And then as I was going through my education process for pastoral ministry, he was going through that process of change. And he was like a case study. You know, does this faith thing work in this incarcerated context? And as I watched him over the years, and he was there for a good number of years, the answer was absolutely. As there was a brightness that came about him, as there was a change in his demeanor, as there was even a change in how he physically carried himself, before walking very stoop-shouldered, but now lifting himself up as he began to realize really the goodness of God in his life. And just a radical transformation. Not too long ago, I received a phone call, and it was this young man who is now just about 40 years old himself, and he was just reflecting upon his time back then and really saying it was there that he was introduced to God. It was there that he found reconciliation, both with the God that made him and his own life and what he had done, and he's doing quite well right now. There are so many others. I have many different youth that call me almost on a weekly basis, from youth that may have left a few months ago to youth that may have been gone for 5 or 6 years. Not too long ago, I had a young man call me out of the blue. He said, "You know who this is." And you know what? I want to know who this is, but you have to tell me your name and tell me the year that you were here. And he did that, and gratefully I was able to remember him, but he had been gone for 10 years. And just one day was talking with someone in his life about his former life, and they were like almost incredulous that he had been incarcerated as a youth. And he kept trying to convince them, "No, I've done some time." And they're like, "No, you haven't. You don't fit that profile." He says, "I'm going to call the chaplain, and he's going to tell you that I did time at the DJJ." So he called me to convince this person that he was trying to share his life story with that he had actually done time. And it ended up being a wonderful conversation, just rejoicing in the good things that had taken place in his life. So much so that as he was telling his life story, now there were people that just couldn't believe that at some point he had been in the state system.
As DJJ prepares to sunset after more than 100 years, really, of treating youth, training youth, educating youth, housing youth, how do you think juvenile justice in California will be remembered?
To be honest with you, I think that largely will be determined on the youth themselves that have come through this. And how do they tell that story? They're the ones that experienced the most here. We work here. This is our employment. It might even be a calling, like it is for me, and I'm grateful for the time that I've been able to spend here. But for them, their lives were radically altered and changed by their stay here. The trajectory of their life may have been turned in a very different direction. how they remember their time here and how they tell the story of what they experienced here and the things that they learned and the things that they experienced and the changes that occurred as a result of their time here. I think they'll be the ones that write the final story of the history of the CYA and the DJJ. I would hope, though, that as in the immediate future, as some can still smell the DJJ even though we're closed, that they'll remember a lot of what we did here as being very helpful. We have quite a history. All of the activities that we have done with our youth and the different programs, the different opportunities that have been provided for them, whether it be through education or work training or even here in this chapel. Youth have experienced things here in this chapel that they may have never experienced before in their life. I remember a number of years ago, I received a phone call from a large religious university in Chicago. They were coming out to Southern California to do a musical concert. Somehow they were told maybe you should go to a youth correctional facility. They called me and they asked if they could bring their 50-piece orchestra, 50-piece orchestra to come and perform in this chapel. And I could not believe my good fortune. I immediately said, yes, don't worry about it. We will work out the details. We will get you in here. And so the institution was gracious enough to open the door for them to come in. And as they came and set up in here, they transformed this chapel into a concert hall. And they did an entire 2-hour concert of amazing classical and sacred and even a couple pieces of contemporary pop music from that orchestra. And I'll never forget that there was a row not too far into the chapel of younger men that came from one of our more troubled living units. And as one particular piece of music was being played, the entire row was bent over with their heads down, and one of them especially was just weeping, was crying, just overwhelmed by what he was experiencing. And afterwards he told me, I've never heard anything like that before in my life. I don't even know what was wrong with me. I don't know why I was crying. It was just, it was beautiful. And those occasions, I think, tell the story of what we did, what we could do, and even what we were able to accomplish. If in that brief moment that young man suddenly became aware in a very deep, even spiritual sense of the grace and the love of God. It happened behind these fences in this correctional setting. That's a story. That's a story of grace. That's a story of reconciliation. That's a story of restoration.